Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fingal's Cave podcast. Today we have another wonderful guest. Rob Chapman writes music books and novels. Formerly a music journalist, Rob is a member of the Royal Society of Authors, the Society of Authors, and a Fellow of the Higher Education Authority. For followers of the Fingal's Cave podcast, Rob is perhaps best known for two groundbreaking books about Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett, An Irregular Head, published in 2010, and The Lyrics of Syd Barrett, published in 2021. Rob's latest novel is Unsung, Unsaid, an exploration of the creativity of Syd Barrett and Nick Drake through the medium of speculative fiction. Over to Ian Priston and Phil Salathé.
Talking of things that happened a long time ago, we normally start these podcast discussions with the age-old question of where did it all start for you, Rob, with Pink Floyd and Syd Barrett, or either or? What are your memories?
I have a very clear memory of hearing Arnold Lane for the first time. I was sitting on the wall outside, a very low wall outside our recreation ground on a spring evening in 1967. I was 12 and a bit years old. And Arnold Lane came on the radio. It was obviously on the Pirates. I always assume it's Radio Caroline because Radio London banned it, so it wouldn't have been in London. But it might have actually been Radio City because they used to play a lot of new stuff as well. And I liked it. And a friend of mine, and kind of when you're 12, you really look up to 14, 15-year-olds. And my older friend said with the wisdom of a 15-year-old, they're called Pink Floyd, they're going to be really famous. And I liked the name immediately because I liked the name of the song, Arnold Lane, and I liked the name of the band, Pink Floyd, and they were kind of interchangeable. It's like almost like you didn't know if it was a record called Pink Floyd by a band called Arnold Lane. And I liked the idea of all of it because it was that time when character songs were first starting to appear, like, you know, Matthew and Son and The Who's Happy Jack. And I kind of linked it in with all those sort of songs straight away. Oh, people are writing songs about strange characters. I probably didn't even get the cross-dressing reference at 12, you know. I just thought, oh, what a lovely name. No one's called Arnold, you know. I mean, I knew people with the surname Arnold in my town, but nobody was called Arnold as a first name. So it stuck, and I really liked it. And it was the fact that my friend had said they're going to be really famous as well. And then, you know, See Emily Play was on Top of the Pops, and I saw that every week. It was on Top of the Pops. And later on, I still swear that I saw them doing Apples and Oranges on, I think it was So It Goes, one of those, no, Come Here Often, something like Come Here Often, one of those kids shows. And I've only ever met one other person who has the same memory, but I do remember it really well because a friend of mine...
What do you remember about it?
I remember liking it and going into school the next day and saying, I love their new record, and a good mate of mine said, oh, no, I don't like it at all, which is why I can date it, because I know this kid, he wasn't in my class in the first year, he only joined us in the second year, and we bonded straight away on music, and sometimes our differences in music, and I remember him and us having this big disagreement about how great Apples and Oranges was, you know, and then it didn't get in the charts, but lots of records I liked at that age didn't get in the charts, they got to like number 42 and disappeared again, you know. But Syd didn't really register until they did that Lifelines in NME in August 67. And Syd didn't fill out half of his questions. There was just this slash. And I remember thinking that was really interesting because everybody else played the game. Everybody else said what their favourite colour was or what their favourite, you know, what their pets were called. And actually, Syd did actually mention the pet, didn't he? Because he said a cat called Rover. But that struck, and I thought, oh, he's an odd one, you know. And then a few months later, it was, oh, they've become a 5-piece, again in NME, because I just used to read NME at that age, just being a pop fan, you know, being 12, you know. And but then just after Christmas, I was 13 by then. I remember the John Peel session, actually, on New Year's Eve, because I was up in my bedroom listening to it, and I had a very, like everyone did, a really crappy little transistor radio. And I wrote down the titles, and when it got to Jug Band Blues, I didn't understand what they said, so I wrote down Jock Van Blues. And to this day, I still think of it as Jock Van Blues because of that. But I do remember hearing that session really well and thinking, oh, they're getting very different. The records are getting, you know, Scream Thy Last Scream is not like the stuff on the album. And then, of course, there was that thing soon after Christmas. David Gilmour has joined the Pink Floyd, and they're now a 5-piece. Oh, great, right, interesting. They're now a 5-piece band. You know, when are they going to make their next record? But then the next thing you see, I think in about April, again, NME news pages, Syd Barrett has now left the Pink Floyd. So I had him marked off very early on as a kind of, this guy doesn't join this guy doesn't play the game, this guy doesn't join in. And it's not like I then obsessively thought about him for 18 months or 2 years until Madcap came out, because one didn't. One was in early teens, and there's so much else interesting going on. You know, Mark Bolan was my big obsession by then, once I heard those early Tyrannosaurus Rex records. But then when Madcap did come out, again, it was intriguing, because here's this guy who I remember 2 years ago as being really famous and having hit singles, and now he's done this really odd album. So that's the early stuff for me. But again, in the meantime, I really got into the Pink Floyd after Syd left, because their records seemed to get more abstract to me. They were just instrumentals, but when you're 12 or 13 and 14, you're very impressionable. I was anyway. I mean, I love the idea of the underground. Once I discovered John Peel's show, and he was playing all these groups I'd never heard of, like Skip Bifferty and Kippington Lodge and all, you know, and the Pretty Things who had gone psychedelic by then, Defecting Grey and all that sort of stuff, blew my mind, you know. And I remember on one Sunday evening when they did that, it was a session they did in '69 with Daybreak on it and the early version of A Narrow Way. And I was walking around town on my own on a Sunday evening. Yeah. It went out twice, didn't it, that year? I remember it was a lovely sunny evening. I had nothing to do, boring Sunday evening in my small town where I lived. And I was just walking around town, looking in shop windows and listening to this session. And every track they played, I thought, they were like the most amazing thing I'd ever heard by then. When I've heard that session back since, it's only because there were like wind generator noises and sound effects on it. But when you're impressionable at 14, you think, this is the future of music. You know, it's all going to get this abstract now. They seem to be getting really abstract to me. Now, that's my perception then. When I think back on it, you know, when I hear those tracks now, it's just the instrumental direction they were going in. But that was so different. That was such a leap from See Emily Play and Apples and Oranges. It did seem like a totally different band. I mean, people think, you know, because I wrote the book, they think that's, you know, I'm just a Syd obsessive and that's it. But in fact, my favourite Floyd period is from sort of Saucer Full of Secrets through to Atom Heart Mother. 68 to 70 is my favourite period. And I saw them in Hyde Park doing Atom Heart Mother in 1970. And I went to one of the Peel in concert things later on around the time of Echoes. So those are the times I saw them live.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, I thought they were wonderful, you know. So it's not like I was then down on the Floyd because I was into Syd, because I love that period of Floyd. Still do. I still love A Narrow Way. You know, I still think it's a wonderful piece of music. I still love the whole architecture of Saucer Full of Secrets, the title track. And I love all those live versions that came out on the box sets when they put out the, you know, Cambridge Staycation and all those 3 or 4 box sets things that came out afterwards. I love all those live versions of it. I mean, without that track, there's no Tangerine Dream. I mean, that's the blueprint for everything Edgar Froese and that lot did for the next 2 years, you know. I love that. I think, you know, I'm a Rick Wright fan. I really am. I love all this stuff. I love the fact that he carried on writing Syd songs after Syd left, you know. They're all beautiful, all of them. You know, Remember a Day and Seesaw. They're gorgeous songs. I love them all.
That makes 3 of us.
I'm with you 100% on that. Yeah. So I might ask also, in parallel with that question, where did you get started with Nick Drake?
Oh, Nick. I heard Time Has Told Me on the Nice Enough to Eat Island sampler that came out in 1969, and I bought that because it was only 14 and 6, and you know, being a working class kid with not much money, I mean, I had to rely on my paper round money. I couldn't afford many full price albums at all, not for a long time. So samplers were great for me, you know. They were cheap, they're easy. But having said that, I didn't particularly like Time Has Told Me. I thought it was a bit ploddy. I still do, actually. And of course, it doesn't help that track is sandwiched in between 21st Century Schizoid Man and and Bloodwind Pigs, Sing Me a Song That I Know So Well, and Traffic. It's kind of in the middle of those, there's this country twang sort of acoustic track. It kind of gets buried, you know, because it's got this kind of, you know, monolith, brilliant prog tracks. Well, not in prog, are they? It's kind of, you know, still underground then. But that's the first I heard. And I heard him incrementally from island sampler to island sampler, and liking him slightly more on each track, on each successive island sampler. But I didn't go out and buy the records until Pink Moon, when I was, this is the thing. I mean, if you've read All I Want Is Out of Here, my second of my memoirs, you'll know that in the same week, I saw Syd Barrett Stars at Cambridge, and in that same NME that I bought that day, going to see Syd, was the full page ad for Pink Moon, the famous one with Syd walking down to the pond in Hampstead with his, you know, back to the camera and the dog running around the corner, and that lovely little thing about, you know, Nick Drake's just delivered his new album, and it played up the mystique of the man, which again I was all for. I bought totally into that, and I thought, oh wow, right. Not only is his music getting more interesting, but he's a mystery man too, you know? So I love that. And I bought Pink Moon, and I loved it, and it seemed very stark to me, but it's got fuller as the years have gone by. And then I went out and bought Brighter Later on the same day that I bought Velvet Underground's White Light, White Heat, about a month later. Imagine those two albums in the same bag, eh? John Cale being the connection. And then about a month after that, I found Five Leaves Left in a department store in Bedford called Braggins. It was a typical department store that had just a little record annex on about the third floor. And what amazes me now is I've got first edition copies of all three of those albums, but I bought Five Leaves Left 2.5 years after it came out, and it was still in the racks and it wasn't selling, which tells you everything you need to know about how off the radar Nick was. Those records, they weren't selling. I mean, estimates vary, don't they, as to how many they did sell in that period, from about 1,000 to 5,000 or 6,000. But there weren't many of us. There obviously weren't. And if I could still find a first edition copy 2.5 years after it came out in a department store, you know, that just shows you. So that was my in. So yes, I bought Nick's records when he was still alive, fully expected there to be a fourth album. And that's it. So that's my introduction to Nick. But it's the fact that it was the same week. You know, the next month I saw Syd on the Thursday at Cambridge Corn Exchange with Stars. The next Monday I went into Cambridge again and bought Pink Moon, because I grew up in Sandy in Bedfordshire, you see, which is only 20 miles from Cambridge. So a lot of my misspent youth was misspent in Cambridge. I mean, Grantchester Meadows was mythical to me before I ever went there because of the track, you know, on Ummagumma. But then I started going to the mythical place that did exist, and I went to free concerts there. There were some wonderful free concerts in Grantchester Meadows, few of which I see documented anywhere. Yes, I remember going to one. It was the day before I started tech college, which was not the best way to prepare for going to tech. And I remember Carol Grimes' Uncle Dog were on, which Jack Monk would have been in, actually, when I think back on it. Donovan's Open Road without Donovan. 3 or 4 other local bands as well, I remember. And I remember a lovely, lovely Sunday afternoon by the river, a beautiful early September's day in 1970. And I went to a couple of gigs there. I mentioned them to people from Cambridge, say, oh, do you mean the Midsummer Common ones? No, not those. These were actually in Grantchester Meadows.
Where there's the long grass now.
Well, now this is the thing. I'm glad you said that, because I've been back a few times over the years, after a gap of many years away, and I can't quite place now where they were. No, do you mean the long grass, like where that lamppost is in the middle still? There was a lamppost there.
Right in the middle.
Further on down than that, further on into the meadows. But having said that, when I went back there last time, when you go back somewhere many years later and it's like a jigsaw. You can't piece it together anymore. And I'm sure it was over there, but hang on, the river bends there, so it can't be there. And, but again, I haven't been able to trace where they were. But I'm surprised there's been no, rock archaeology on these things. And archivists have been onto it, but nobody seems to have done,
Yeah. It's the sort of thing you'd find on a web page, isn't it, normally? Talking of places from the past, let's talk about your book, Unsung, Unsaid. A great pleasure reading it was, and straight from the outset for me, because you started talking about Kensington Market, which is my childhood, and you clearly have been there a few times in its heyday. Doesn't exist anymore, of course.
It's gone. Again, I was back there recently, and it's gone, hasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, totally gone. And I remember it used to have a funny smell to it. You used to always be able to find a dead end around most corners at Kensington Market. And then it was so hit and miss. You would have these little shops which were absolute rubbish, and then you go into another one and somebody would have a rack full of really interesting records. And then, indeed, just like your book, there'd be a cafe. So were you actually writing that from memory?
I'll go back to the beginning. I'll tell you what I did and how we ended up in Kensington Market. Once I got the idea for the book, which came originally from a what if tweet, and then I thought, no, that's a good idea. I'll do that. I'll do the book. The first kind of logical problem we have, of course, is like, right, how are we going to get them in the same place? And not only that, what are we going to get them saying to each other? Because obviously, when I put the original tweet up, and even when I first said what the book I'd done, you had one or two smart Alex got on there with a reply saying, making up their own spoof dialogue between Syd and Nick along the lines of, what are you doing these days then, Nick? Not a lot, you? No, nothing. And then, ha, 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 Twitter bants, But I thought, actually, that was the problem I faced from the outset. Logically, what are we going to get these guys doing and saying to each other? So what I did was, as a writer, I thought, right, let's put them in the same room. Not only that, let's put them at the same cafe table, facing each other, and make them get on with it. That was my challenge to me as a writer. Right, you're next to each other. What's going to happen from here? And of course, I then did, for some reason, I did then zoom in on, let's make it Kensington Market Cafe. That little cafe that was on, I think it was on the second floor. I think I put it on the third floor in the book. But hey, that's a novel, so that's not real.
You trap them.
I trap them.
You trap them together.
I trap them. I trap them and make them speak. They've got to. They're facing each other. Yeah, and that's how it proceeded. But from there on, it got easier and easier. But yes, of course, I drew entirely on memory for the Kensington Market stuff because I remember it really well, and I went there a lot. Early 70s, up until around that period when Bieber was a lot just along the road as well, and I managed to crowbar in a little reference to Bieber, when the cafe owner's not based on him, by the way, although the drug dealer is based on. There was always a surreptitious dope dealer in there. I do remember that very well. So some of that's from real, and of course, unbeknownst to me at the time, but Freddie Mercury was working downstairs as well, wasn't he? He was a stall. Yeah. Yes, he was a stall holder. I can't remember if it was with other members of Queen or not. And again, that I'm not going to plot spoil here, but I allude to those sort of things. I try not to kind of make it heavy-handed and crowbar them in, but anyone who's read that goes, aha, I know what you mean there, Rob. I know that is, And there's a few of those. I put them in for the spotters, There's a few little moments where you think, I've got a knowing audience here. If anyone's going to buy this book, they're going to be Syd and Nick fans, and they're going to know the territory. So once in a while, you put in one where fans will go, "Oh, right, I know what that's meant to be," just occasionally. But to be honest, writing that book, it was so easy. I mean, there were never any problems. There were never any logistical problems. Once I got over the idea of where can we go with this, I realised we could go anywhere. Getting Nick's voice was going to be more problematic because with Syd, you can put him in social situations because he was in social situations. The early life in Cambridge, very easy to do. Even the wandering around London during his twilight years, he was seen, he was visible. Nick, invisible. So with Nick, I had to do more internal dialogue stuff like letters to people and tape. Remember, there's that tape letter on YouTube, isn't there, of Nick late one night getting back to his room, and speaking into a tape recorder. So that was one of those, again, a light bulb moment where he thought, yeah, we'll have him doing another one of them then, And so they build and build and build. And there was never a moment where I thought, oh, I'm halfway through this, but where am I going to go next? It was never a struggle. It was I was surprised how easy it was to write,
Were you ever afraid that anybody would take offence to it or would mock what you'd achieved?
Well, you know, some people started to do that as soon as I said what the book was about. I sensed a certain amount of resistance from Nick fans more than Syd fans, particularly on social media, and particularly on some of the Facebook pages I joined, you know. But again, several of them have come round to it and seem to really love it, you know. But I seem to be better known with Syd fans. But then again, I've made a few enemies on Syd, certain notorious Syd sites over the years. They didn't take to a very irregular head, some of them. You know, it's the problem with obsessive fandom, isn't it, really? I mean, I have
absolutely. We have that with this podcast.
Oh, I'm sure.
We get some people loving it and others, you know, are just very unhappy about anything we say. Particularly an episode with Syd's sister, Rosemary Breen. We were just talking about that before speaking to you, and people wanted her to be grilled. And it's just not.
No, I wasn't going to do that with the book either. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean, I was told, you know, off the record, I was told 3 or 4 stories about Syd that left you in no doubt that he was not in the best of mental health later in life. But I'm not a news of the world muckraker. I'm not going to put those in the book so people can go, oh yeah, you know. I mean, I tread carefully around the whole area of mental health, and I despise these people who used to go and doorstep him and stuff like that, or, you know, paparazzi him in the street, the stalker video, the famous stalker video and all. I loathe those people. I mean, would you go and do that? You know, if you had a mentally unstable son or daughter or father or mother or auntie or uncle, would you mind if we all went and knocked on their door and pestered them like that? Of course you. Well, what? So why do it with Syd? Because he used to be famous 50 years ago. You know, I think it's despicable. I really do, and I'll get shit for that, but I don't mind. You know, because I don't inhabit the same moral universe as those people. I'm afraid. You know.
I was going to say, it seems to be becoming even more commonplace now that people want to trot out those stories as well.
Oh yes, I knew full well that if I put, you know, I mean, a couple of stories told to me within the family. One told to me from someone who used to see him about in Cambridge in later life. And one from somebody on the, shall we say, the legal medical side of things, who got in touch with me after the book came out and told me a few things. And I thought, yeah, I could go and blab all this on the internet, but I'm not going to. I'm just not. And but the same when I spoke to Rosemary. I mean, she was great. She gave me a good interview, but she gave me a sister's perspective, which I quite like, but that has its limits. You can't ask a sister about the artist, you know, because you don't know. You wouldn't go and talk to my sister about my books, you know. My sister will be livid if she sees this now.
Speaking of sisters, by the way, I was very intrigued by the chapter where you essentially sort of reverse Nick's career with his sisters, right? In other words, you imagine what if he had inhabited the role of an actor while she was off making records, or at least that I hope.
Yes, no, that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
And it's an intriguing premise, because I think it points up to something that I think may not be maybe obvious to all people who hear about the premise of the book, is that you look at the entire subject from different angles, right? It's not merely a tale where it's only organized around these encounters between Syd and Nick, and everything else is sort of vestigial. It's much more kaleidoscopic, or at least I experienced it as a much more kaleidoscopic story.
It is. There are 22 chapters. No 2 chapters are alike. I make sure that no chapter is too long that it outstays its welcome. I didn't want anyone going, oh, he's doing this again, you know. That's why they're all short, sharp, snappy. And they vary in length from about 1,500 words to about 4,500. But yeah, nothing outstays its welcome. I was determined not to do that. And I was also determined not to make them mirror images of each other. So if I did a chapter on Syd in the studio, which I do later on, I don't then do Nick in the studio trying to make his final album. I don't do that at no point do I offer mirror images of each other. But I'm glad you enjoyed that chapter, because again, it was one of those little sparks. I was very careful not to put stuff like that early on in the book. That chapter, I think, is about something like number chapter 13 or 14, isn't it, out of 22 chapters? And if I'd have put that in as like chapter 3 or something, people would have gone, oh, come on, you know, because you've got to lead the reader in. I won't say gently, because that sounds condescending, but you've got to baby steps at first, you know. By the time you get to chapter 13 or 14, you think, well, if the reader's still with me now, they're with me for the long haul. They're here for the whole journey now. So that's why there are a couple of chapters around that point which do I would never have put those early on. And I did think, yeah, what if the situation had been reversed? What if Nick had been a successful actor, his sister, but again, I didn't make the sister a literal copy of Nick. I didn't make her make 3 albums on Ireland. I mean, well, I won't plot spoil, but she doesn't do that. But yes, you're quite right. I've reversed them. And of course, it also allows you to have a perspective on what they were both like. And the fact that I make his mother, having been an actress herself, and so she's still living slightly vicariously through Nick, the famous actor. Well, semi-famous actor anyway. I also make sure he gets a few bit parts. You know, he's not world famous, because again, I thought that's interesting, because I've always been intrigued. You know, when you hear those records by Molly, the songs that she wrote, there quite clearly is an influence there. I mean, Nick's vocal delivery is similar. Even some of the songs, they have that kind of wistful, slightly detached air that some of Nick's more wistful songs do, which I found fascinating. So I thought, yeah, let's switch them here and see where we go with this.
Yeah, I have the album that they put out of Molly Drake's music, and it's quite striking. It's got this very melancholy sound to it that's rather haunting. It has a very, I mean, this feels sort of like a maybe too facile thing to say, but it's got a sort of rainy day quality to it. It feels fundamentally just melancholy, you know, music that kind of looks out the window to some degree, and also connects very much with the kind of art songs of the late 19th and popular songs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the kind of things that people would gather around perhaps and play at the piano.
Yes, which they will have done at home, of course. And I mean, I do mention that there's a little aside, isn't there, where you can imagine Molly having been at home in Palm Court orchestras and tea dances and Noel Coward kind of reviews and things like that. There's that side of her, definitely. Yeah. Well, Joe Boyd said, didn't he, when that stuff was, when they first unearthed those tapes and Joe Boyd heard them, and he said, this is the missing link, isn't it? And it is. It is one of the great missing links.
On the topic of melancholy, I think a book as kaleidoscopic as this one, I would hesitate to try to reduce it down to any one thesis or any one feeling, but I was struck by, there's a theme that comes back over and over again. One of them in the chapter where, I don't want to spoil what's happening, but it begins with Nick having recently, as I recall, sired a child with, I don't remember the name of his wife. They're all at a party, everybody's acting a bit strangely. And in the course of this, if I recall correctly, there's a reference to a fantasy novel that's not really well known on my side of the pond, but I guess is better known over there. Is it Elidor? Is that how you pronounce it?
By Alan Garner, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a place where you write, the uncomfortable moral of Elidor is that paradise is lost, never to be regained, not even in childhood. And then at other places, you have characters say, it will never be as beautiful as this ever again. To which, in fairness, somebody rejoins, until it is, which is a good rejoinder. And then he thought back to a time when everything seemed possible. So perhaps it's inevitable, given the topic of two men who both had so much to give and whose creativity, and in one case, his life, was tragically cut short. But it did strike me that there's this kind of melancholy that maybe just inherently is going to hang over. And the feeling, I think in particular, of that there had been a time when things felt more possible, that the world felt more alive, and then people are left trying to do what they can in the wake of all that vibrancy in life having gone away.
Well, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in what you said. There's a lot of that in my nature. I'm very drawn to that melancholy in music. In fact, I went into a lot more detail with that when I wrote my doorstop of a book on Psychedelia and Other Colours, which was the follow-up to A Very Irregular Head, which I did with Faber and Faber. And there's a whole chapter in that called The Penny Arcadia, where I try to trace back why so many English pop songs of the 60s and late 60s in particular are melancholy and looking back. I mean, when the Beatles take acid, they get in touch with their inner child and they write songs about Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane and their past. And of course, I trace a lot of it back in British culture and in psychedelic culture in particular, back to things like, a lot of it goes back to the First World War. It goes back to the loss of all those young lads at the Somme and Flanders Fields, you know, and that's still in the psyche. You got to remember, when all those kids are growing up, that's still within living memory. Their grandparents will have had memories. I mean, I'm almost of that generation. I was born in 1954. I was born 9 years after the Second World War ended. So I knew people. I would see the the Remembrance Day parade on November the 11th, and there would be a small bunch of old soldiers from the First World War, about as many now, incidentally, as there are left of the Second World War, because we've all got old, you know. But I can remember that. That's in my consciousness too. And there were stories from then at those times as well. And I think a lot of it goes back to that. I think there's something rooted in the English psyche that goes back to that period, and the period of it, not innocence, but the period just before the First World War, when all of that was, that whole Edwardian world was just destroyed, you know. And you see that my overarching thesis with Psychedelia is that it's part of a periodic revival, which seems to happen every few years when Victoriana or Edwardiana are either in or they're out. And you'll find that throughout the 20th century. You couldn't give away Victorian stuff after the First World War. Nobody wanted the spoils of the colonial enterprise at that time. They'd just seen millions slaughtered in the battlefields of Europe, you know. 10 years later, there was a massive revival in Victorian architecture, people like John Betjeman and, you know, that whole crowd of people. And to me, Psychedelia, as much as it being about pop tunes, which it also is, and drugs and about LSD, is also about that. It's part of that periodic revival where, and suddenly, of course, Syd's totally part of that. He suddenly starts writing songs based on 19th century children's literature. That's utterly part of that. That is utterly tapped into the root of that culture. He had that kind of taproot going all the way back to that. He had an understanding of that, I think. So that's where I'm coming from with all of that. There's an element of that I find very easy, not just to write. I find it easy to evoke, because I still hear, and I hear it more now. I'm getting older, without getting too kind of, you know, morbid about this. You know, I'm 70 in November. And I'm looking back over a life now. I've got more years behind me than ahead of me. And I do start to look at those moments in time where, yes, there was a period in the 60s where, you see, I'm not a 60s nostalgist in that way about, oh, it was the best of times. Everyone has the best of times when they're young, you know. But there was a period then where it seemed to me like all of the cultures came together. There were the light shows, the poetry, the dance, the theatre, the mixed media. They all came together for an all too brief a period to me. And then suddenly, by about the late 60s, it all got rationalised again, and they all separated again. They all went back off into their little world. The art people went back over there, and the theatre people went back over there. And I mean, it was nice that the Pink Floyd did the collaborations that they did on films and with you know, with ballet, you know, with Roland, what's his name, Petit's group, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. And in fact, I liked it in recent years when there was a bit of a revival with, you know, one or two of the more modern electronic or psychedelic bands, like Broadcast. I'm a massive Broadcast fan, and they had an incredible light show. I'm still a sucker for all that stuff. If all that came back again now, not in a revivalist way, they did something new with it, with new technology and new possibilities, I'd still be up for it. I love immersive environments. I love the whole notion of that, you know.
The one time I've been to France, by the way, I happened to get there. My wife and I got there on a day that they happened to be doing a big community light show in Nancy, France. And I have to say, looking at that and looking at what they were able to do with modern technology, what they did was fine and lovely and, you know, perfect for a kind of community-oriented event. But it definitely made the artist in me go, give me the controls to this thing. I'd like to find out what we can do with it.
Yeah.
The way they took the physical environment and transformed it into something completely different was something I just never seen before.
Yes, totally.
Especially not on that kind of public scale.
And of course, Syd loved being in the light show. I made that point very strongly in A Very Irregular Head, where he loved to be immersed in the light show because he wasn't a show guitarist. He didn't throw you never see him throwing shapes or playing the kind of macho guitar hero. The opposite, in fact. It's almost like a kind of feminized approach. And he wanted to be part of the immersive environment himself. He was playing off the light show a lot of the time. Several people I interviewed told me that, you know, how you would see Syd on stage playing to the light show, synchronizing what he did to the light show, which again, you know, that's the artist in Syd, of course. He wanted to take all that further. It was never about just being on a stage with a guitar in a band.
Because people might imagine it's the other way around, mightn't they? They might imagine it was the light show following him.
It probably was. Probably was actually. It was probably synchronized, both of them. Yeah, I'm going by what people told me who saw the Floyd at UFO. You know, this is actual people who were there, And I tend to trust their judgment. You know, you would see Pete Brown told me that, for example. Jenny Fabian told me that. Several people mention it too many times for it to be coincidental.
Going back a little bit to Unsung, Unsaid, there were some interesting characters in there. And one of the people that stood out to me, just for personal reasons, was the man who got starstruck by seeing Syd in the street. And I wondered whether that character was based on anybody.
Well, we know it was, don't we? And
Was
and
it
we all
Mr.
know who it
White?
was too. Yeah, yeah. I knew. I
Mr.
knew
Bernard
I
White.
knew Bernard
Yeah.
a bit in the late 70s, early 80s. I was living in London from 1979 to 1983, and he kept popping up in all these different little record shops. It would happen periodically. You could kind of set your watch by after a few months, you know, where because I would wander into all the record shops everywhere, you know, and you'd walk into some little kind of like go down some stairs to a cellar, and oh, you're here now, are you? You know. I remember him being in Hanway Street behind Oxford Road, just along from Rocks Off, where Shane McGowan used to work. Used to stand behind the counter anyway. I don't think he did much work. I remember him at a little place up in Camden by the market next to Sea of Tunes. Sea of Tunes was on the corner, which Barry used to run. He was the guy who was responsible for bringing all the first Smile bootleg stuff to Britain. He was responsible for all that early Smile stuff that we all heard, you know. And he had a little shop behind there for a while. I remember him being in Newport Court in Soho. It was around that.
Oh, you did follow
Oh
him.
no, but it was more a case of you go in a shop and you're here now, are you? You know, hello Bernard. I mean, he's the one who wrote out the rooftop, the poem that's supposed to be Syd, but it's not, you know. And I've seen that printed elsewhere. In fact, I had to go onto one of the websites. I think not that they ever credited me, and say, look, I've still got my handwritten thing here from Bernard. Here it is. That's the handwriting. That's Bernard's handwriting, because here's the one he wrote out for me on the back of a flyer for his Hanway Street shop. In fact, you know, Hanway Court shop. But yeah, he's kind of. I'm going to be diplomatic here because. You know, one heard a lot of stories about the guy, and I'm not going to speak ill of the dead either. You know, but he wasn't. He was an obsessive to the point of kind of to a degree that I'm not comfortable with at all. Let's put it that way. But yeah, there has to
he put everything.
There has to be a cameo. Well, and also one thing I didn't like was when he redid all the Terrapins, because I did the original review of Syd Barrett's Stars at Cambridge in one of the earliest Terrapins. He basically rewrote that for his and he told me he was going to rewrite it. And I thought, oh, okay, it's your mag, mate, you know. But it was me who was there. I mean, to this day, no one would know what Syd and Stars performed on that stage if it wasn't for my original piece that I wrote for Terrapin, about Terrapin number, whatever it was, 2 or 3. I was one of the original members. I should have brought my little card out, actually. I've still got my original membership card with, I think I'm number 26 or something, or 16, something like that. I'm one of the earliest members.
It was an interesting little community back then, wasn't it?
And it was a tiny community.
Yeah. A lot of it centred around London, North London in particular. And I knew Bernard quite well, and I was young when I knew him, and he'd always used to say to me, "Hello, young man, how are you today?" And he used to introduce me to everybody as, "This young man is a fan of the Pink Floyd. He's a jolly good chap." And I used to thoroughly enjoy hearing his stories, and he left us too soon, I think. And so it was rather nice to see him pop up in your book in that way. And it's a story that's often told still now, isn't it? Because I think that moment when he bumped into Syd was the single most important moment in his life. It's always seemed that way to me.
I guess. I mean, I know, you know, he went to Cambridge with the guy who was going to play him in that little film that Jenny Fabian's in. That I can't remember his name now. And I know he was told to behave himself and just to keep out of sight, but he didn't. He kind of jumped out and, you know, "Hello, Syd," you know, and Syd like banged the door and just went back in again, you know. But I'm not easy talking about someone who's no longer with us to defend himself, you know. I don't want to do that. But yeah, I mean, if anyone's going to get, if a kind of fanatic, you know, to use the proper term, you know, was ever going to make their way into a little cameo in that book, it had to be Bernard, you know. Yeah.
Another character that interested me was the bootlegger character. Was that bootlegger based on anybody, or just generally people in that scene? Because the bootleggers were absolutely crucial, weren't they?
Totally, which 70s. Is why I have that there's a little coda to the end of chapter 1, where when Syd and Nick have left, and when you're left with the bootlegger stroke drug dealer and the cafe owner chatting, and I haven't got it to hand, so I don't want to paraphrase my own book badly, but
do you want the text? I can give it to you. It says, "One day when they come to write the histories of these times, they'll have to talk to the drug dealers and the bootleggers. You'll get a very one-sided story."
Damn right, and that's true. I mean, I believe that personally anyway. And they still never go and talk to the drug dealers. You know, they're always the hidden people. You know, and yet they're the people. You know, where were all the famous groups going? But you know, that's absolutely right. I've lost the thread. Where were we going with this? And where were we going with that?
The importance of the bootlegger.
Oh yeah, no, but he's not based on anyone in particular. No,
role.
They're important, but he's not. He's a completely made up character. Yeah, obviously. Although, of course, the smart viewers, when they get to that bit, they'll go, "Oh, it's the guy from the first chapter." Yeah, of course, you know. But no, he's not. He's not actually based on anyone at all. No, he's made up out of my own vast imagination.
He's also an opportunity, I think, for you to talk about something that, particularly for those of our listeners who are mainly Pink Floyd fans and don't know so much about Nick Drake, that about half of the tracks referred to in that chapter, I believe it's the one at least I have in mind is the one called An Old Fairy Tale, where about half of it is material that we have from Nick Drake on one of a couple different posthumous albums. They weren't released on the first 3, but they were recorded in the studio. And then about half of it, and this is something I actually didn't know until I read the books, I'd never looked into it, are titles that we know he wrote, but that we don't have the. Do we have even a trace of them?
Yes.
Neither lyrics nor
yes,
recording,
no,
right?
they're all.
Oh, we do have lyrics?
Yes, they're all from Remembered for a While. They're all from the estate book, the Nick Drake estate book that came out, and that's the chapter.
Which I haven't yet read to my.
You must. It's the chapter by Peter Paphides towards the end, which is a really interesting chapter because it shows how it was utterly feasible that there would have been a 4th album. You see, hindsight has given us all these, you know, neat little cut-off points, knowing what we know now. But when they were still alive, those two, believe me, in 1974, it was still feasible to believe that Syd would make his 3rd solo album and Nick would make his 4th. And there was a piece in Melody Maker, which I've still got somewhere, in the Raver column, in the gossip column in Melody Maker, mentioning when Nick had turned up ready to make a new album. And at the time, this is only a few months before he died. But, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and we all seem the doomed romantic poet in them both now, some of which I have some time for, and it's inevitable. Other bits, I think, I remember when they were still working artists, and it was still possible that these things were going to happen, you know? And, you know, there is that bit where he turned up saying he was ready to go. And, of course, it's like obviously the last 4 or 5 tracks that he recorded, you know? But, yes, I still prefer to remember Nick in that kind of way. I remember the Nick who was still alive when I bought his records, you know, and my money would have gone into a royalty statement somewhere along the line. It wouldn't have been very much, but my few pennies, like the other few pennies of the other $5,000 or $6,000 who bought those records, would have found their way onto a royalty statement at some point while he was still alive. And I wish more people had known about him when he was still alive. It's wonderful that it all happened later, which is why I get so eulogizing in that final chapter. Because I did by then there's no longer any pretense that these can be based on real people. We're now offering purely into the fictional sphere. And I think it's wonderful that subsequent generations picked up on what just a few of us knew at the time, what a few of us heard and thought, these are beautiful records. And as I've said many a time before when I've been asked to talk about this sort of thing, I don't recall having a single conversation with a music fan about Nick Drake when I was 20 at the end of 1974. So we're talking about the entirety of my late teens, the second half of my teens. Not once did I ever have a conversation with somebody about Nick Drake. it's hard to overemphasize now just how below the radar he was. Nobody was talking about him, nobody at all. And unless they occasionally said, oh yeah, didn't he have a track on Nice Enough to Eat? Or, that's all they remembered. That's all they knew, really. And I'm so glad that subsequent generations have picked up on his music. And it's only a shame it couldn't have happened when he was still here with us. And that is said from the heart.
There's a really lovely first-person concert review early in the book. I found it very sensitively written, and there were a couple things about it that really popped out to me. One actually is, particularly in light of your mentioning that Time Has Told Me, which is the first track on Nick's first album, didn't particularly grab you when you first heard it. You also have your reviewers say that describe Riverman as Nick's finest work to date. Is that the author's voice speaking, or is the reviewer someone who holds views distinct from your own?
Now, at the time, it was the most beautiful piece of Nick's music, possibly one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever made. Because at the time, Brighter Later was my favourite album, because I was lulled in by the orchestration and the richness and the whole classical portraiture of that album. The first album sounds like, first album, not promising debut, that's what it sounds like, promising debut. Some nice moments on it, some slightly more. I don't recall being that gone on 3 Hours from London when I was first heard it. I thought it was a bit sprawling, But I've heard that alternative version, which is absolutely fantastic. But anyway, I'm going to drift here. And of course, I thought of Pink Moon as being utterly stark and empty. Of course, as time goes by, I've started to find occasionally Brighter Later can be a bit cloying, a bit too rich in the orchestration. And I can fully understand why Nick, as a reaction to that, said to Joe Boyd, next album's going to be, just me, or it's going to be, it's going to be less of it. And of course, what I heard as stark when I first heard it, I was really into Loudon Wainwright. This is a comparison that will send you sideways. I like the first two. I like the first two Loudon Wainwright albums. They are empty and bare in a very similar kind of way. All those wonderful songs on those first Loudon Wainwright albums, like Motel Blues and Be Careful There's a Baby in the House. They're stark and empty. And I kind of lumped Pink Moon in with those first two Loudon Wainwright albums for its sheer emptiness. Of course, as the years have gone by, it's kind of filled and blossomed, and now I don't think of it as an empty and stark album at all. I find it absolutely full. I find it fulsome. When you hear songs like From the Morning and the title track, again they sound utterly full. It doesn't sound stark and bare at all. But of course, what I'm talking about here is the way your own views on your own perspective on music changes as you go through life. The album hasn't changed at all. The album is still the same notes in the same order as they ever were. It's me who's evolved, and I now, it's like looking at a beautiful classical vase or something. When the sunlight kind of shafts lean on it in a certain way, it looks melancholic. In a certain other way, it can look grand. In a certain other way, it can look foreboding. In a certain other way, it's just as a silhouette. There's nothing there but a shape. And it's the same with music. It's the same with all music, actually. I'm getting metaphysical on you now, but I mean, I do find that with Nick's music. Depending on the angle of the sunlight on them, they still yield up new things all the time, those records. They still carry on giving to me. They are not set in stone, those records, ever, at all. And so I'm saying at the moment, I find some of the orchestration a bit lush. I find the instrumentals a little bit, I won't say Muzak-y, that would be insulting, but they're a bit Radio 2 for me, But that will change. That may well change, and I'll come back to them one day and go, well. In fact, that did happen about 3 or 4 years ago. I hadn't listened to Brighter Later for about 5 years. And God, I played it in full. And it's like every track was like going into a mansion room, in a room in a mansion. And there was a different classical portrait on the wall in each room. And it was like that. It was like walking the corridors of this beautiful mansion. And in this room, there's Hazy Jane. And in this room, there's one of these things first. And it was, it was glorious. Those records will never date to me. Actually, they are timeless. They're of their time. They're quite early, they're quite obviously 1970s, early 70s albums, but in a way they are utterly timeless to me. All three of them.
The word classical has appeared a few times now in this conversation. I think a passage that really struck me. My day job is teaching music, and while I do include as much jazz and popular music as I can, a lot of my bread and butter ends up being classical music. And I was literally just showing my students the Andante from Brandenburg 4, and the place where you propose a sort of an imaginary set list in which the ending of Brandenburg 4, the slow movement, goes into Way to Blue. It's a really, really well heard, well imagined idea for folks who might not know Brandenburg 4, the second movement of the Andante. It ends with something called a Phrygian half cadence, which makes me feel like that, mythical Beatles reviewer who started talking about Aeolian cadences and thoroughly confused the Beatles.
Wilfred Mellors, yeah.
Yes, but what it is it's a way of ending. It's this thing that was really quite peculiar to the Baroque era, although it does show up in other eras, where they would end a movement in a very unresolved state. And then they would proceed on with the next movement, as though often in a completely different key. It's something that you don't really see from your Mozarts and your Brahms at all, right? It's particular to that era. And so what ends up happening in that movement is that you end with this chord that normally would point to another chord. And then that chord to which it points is exactly the same as it's an E minor chord, which is the first chord that you get in Way to Blue. So yeah, I thought, damn, that's a really good idea. That would work together.
Well,
very
I
well.
went in very deep. You see, that's only chapter 3, isn't it? I thought, well, let's go in a way. That was a kind of little light-hearted introduction. Well, not light-hearted, but it was a kind of, let's imagine a concert where, Nick was playing with a small, a broken consort. Let's imagine this. And I went in very deep there. I listened to a lot of classical music myself, and I listened to a lot of Bach. And there are certain overlaps of certain pieces. And it was the same because I brought in John Dowland as well, didn't I? For similar reasons. Because there's stuff in the Lacrimae where I hear some of those Robert Kirby orchestrations. But that's me going in very deep from the start. That's me not just saying, oh, let's just imagine a nice little, concert at the festival hall with some other musicians, no, let's give this a classical group playing with him. But this is what could have been. I wanted that to make the reader yearn for that to have been real. And Nick Drake's a fan to have gone, oh God, if only that could have happened,
Yeah, quite successful in my case. I thought to myself, oh, that would have been perfect.
Yeah.
I think it also underscores the fact that, as we've alluded to a couple of times, Nick had, certainly when compared to Syd and to Pink Floyd in general, he had much more of a connection to classical music. I mean, there's a recording of him playing clarinet, I think, on an arrangement of a Mozart trio. I don't remember. I think they put that out on the Family Tree recording, I want to say, but I think there's a recording of him playing with, I don't remember whether it's his mother and somebody else, but so he also apparently played clarinet, which I didn't know until that came out. And I think a thread of classical music definitely is palpable in his music specifically.
Well, he would have heard a lot of that at home as well, of course. Because, the other thing they've both got in common is, they're both the products of upper middle class families, and all of the advantages and cultural capital that would have entailed, and good for them. That both of them were richer for it, for the intellectual circles they were able to move in, simply because of the family background, and that's great. They went off in completely different directions, of course.
Our listeners will be folks who are pretty versed in and I think probably generally pretty intrigued by the wealth of recordings of Pink Floyd that are not officially released. I mean, granted, they mooted a lot of that by putting a lot of things out on the box set, but there's still a fair bit of stuff that's only on bootlegs. And Nick Drake, similarly, his family, they did put out a bunch of things on Family Tree, and there's the compilations, but I'm wondering, there's still a fair amount of stuff that hasn't made it onto any official release. Is there anything in particular that you find really striking among those songs and for that matter, those cover versions? At one point in the book, you described the idea of Nick Drake doing a covers album. Are there any of those that stand in your mind as things that our listeners might seek out and find particularly illuminating?
Well, it's all there on the internet, isn't it? I mean, on YouTube, there are hours of this stuff, aren't there? Of some of the bedroom recordings and the recordings around. I've forgotten his other friend's name. Wells. Simon Wells. I've forgotten his first name. Shame on me. Wells. His friend's house. And there's a few of them. There's a wealth of stuff on YouTube, and I think they should put that stuff out. You've got to remember that for years, the Pink Floyd adamantly said that they couldn't put out Scream Thy Last Scream and Vegetable Man because they were substandard. In fact, I remember them being played very cheekily on BBC Radio London on a program called Breakthrough in the early 70s. And that's
Mike Sparrow.
It was either Mike Sparrow doing it or it was the other guy, Steve Bradshaw. Yeah, I think it was Mike Sparrow. You're right, actually. Yeah.
It was Mike Sparrow. Yeah.
And that's where I first heard them. And I thought, why aren't these available? And then later on, I bought the bootleg, the one called Syd Barrett, where it's spelt SID on the front cover. And there's the still of them on top of the pops on the front cover. Unforgotten Hero. That's where I first was able to buy them. And as the years went by, I thought, why aren't these available? And then, of course, Jesus and Mary's Chain did that wonderful version of Vegetable Man, which really captured the kind of sardonic quality to it, I thought, brilliantly. The kind of garage band, energy of that track. And in fact, I did ask Mr. Gilmour, and I think he said for years it was vetoed. They always had that role. I think they still have that idea in Pink Floyd, don't they? If one person vetoes it, it's not done. I think Monty Python had exactly the same, and Democracy, actually. If one person said it doesn't go in, it doesn't go in. And I think for years, Roger Waters vetoed it all, didn't he? Then it all finally comes out, and I don't know why they didn't just put them out years ago. I really don't. We'd all heard them by then.
When you were talking to David Gilmour about those songs, were you thinking of when you assisted with the 2021 lyrics book? Was that the time when you were talking to him?
Well, that's the first. No, because I'd first. My relationship with David goes back to a very Irregular Head, where now here's a funny thing. I'll tell you the story of this. I don't know how often I air this, but I'd done the first draft. Okay, I'm sorry. That's what am I talking about? I'd done my completed draft, sent it off to Faber, and had gone off on holiday. I was in Greece with my wife. I sent in the completed final draft of A Very Irregular Head. I was on holiday in Greece with my wife, and this was would have been about 2008, 2009, and I vowed that I wouldn't check emails or anything. I didn't have a mobile phone at that point, but there were still the internet cafes, and we were walking past an internet cafe, and I said, I think I'll just go and check my email, for my whatever it is, a couple of euros, logged in on one of the little consoles in this internet cafe. Remember internet cafes? Oh. And there's an email there saying, there's a message from David Gilmour saying, Rob, a copy of your book came my way. Now, I've still to this day never been able to establish how a copy of my book came his way. But then, fingers in pies and all that, and Polly has a very, a literary long reach, so, and he said, it'd be nice to chat about this. And although he was very complimentary about the book, all the Pink Floyd said no originally, like they always do. They routinely say no to everything. And David was gracious enough to say, if I'd have known it was going to be a decent book, I would probably have got on board sooner. And as it was, he got on board right at the end and went through the entire book and fact-checked for me, corrected a couple of nice, made one or two really useful suggestions. No, that didn't happen, or blah, 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 little bits he took out or bits he elaborated on, which was great, And, I think he even proofread the odd bit, even put in a straight umlaut. He put in an umlaut somewhere where it hadn't been. And he was obsessive. He was great. And I had a really nice kind of email relationship with him simply because of that. He was very helpful in the latter stages, incredibly helpful. So when it came to doing the lyrics book, Omnibus approached me, actually, and it was just before lockdown, funnily enough. So, no sooner had I been commissioned to do that than we went into lockdown. And then it was a question of, well, we ought to get David involved, didn't we? And I said, oh, definitely. So I had a nice little to and fro of emails with David about, we should do this. And then, of course, the wonderful thing happened where David got down all the master tapes and he isolated all the vocal tracks. And so, because we were trying to work in certain places, even to this day, it's still difficult to work out what Syd's singing in certain points. In fact, if you've got that book, you'll know, I think there's a couple of footnotes under two songs where it's either this or this, where even after listening to the isolated vocal tracks, you couldn't tell. And of course, Syd used to change the lyrics all the time, which is what eventually resolved the whole thing of, does he sing Madcap laughs or does he sing Madcat laughs? Because I always heard Madcat when I heard it. And of course, when David isolated the vocal tracks, there were 3 vocal tracks on Octopus. And would you believe it? He sings both. He sings cats on a couple of them, and he sings cap on one, which is why, of course, you hear both, because it's possible to hear both. And if you go away and listen to that now knowing what I've told you, if you want to hear cats, you'll hear cats. If you want to hear cap, you'll hear cap. And the reason for that is they are both on there.
There's a snap to his voice, isn't there, at that moment? So that's very easy to get muddled.
And of course, he was sending me all these brilliant vocal tracks. And of course, that's where he sent me, the holy grail of all this is the mumbled bit on No Man's Land. And when it goes into the tell me, what does he sing after that? And I've still got my MP3 at home with that. I've got Syd's what Syd speaks after tell me. And of course, there's all these guest versions on the internet. There's always kind of phonetic versions of what people think he's doing, and they don't bear any resemblance. For a start, he gabbles it much faster than you imagine. You imagine he's singing it maybe in that slow Mandrax drawl of, you would hold your head up high. Yeah. You imagine it's all going to be... No, once he goes into tell me, it's like Bob Dylan amphetamine speed prose. He gabbles through it really fast. And it's, and of course, the phonetic version does finally appear in the lyrics book. But even there with it, I've tried reading that and then still listen to the track with headphones on. And there was one bit in the middle where you hear him go, which I always thought was Heavenly Spaced Orchestra. And there's that one little bit where it breaks open, the clouds part, and you can almost hear, and it's heavily spaced. It's not orchestra, though, it's something else. And I thought, wow, after all these years, there it finally is. And of course, in isolation, it's a wonderful kind of, it's like a piece of freeform poetry of its own. And, David said he remembers, in the studio, he remembers Syd would have these strips of paper, which he would use.
Poetry broth.
A lot of it, I'd imagine, and it would have been Syd's own versions of poetry broth as well, I would think. That's a story. The Spike Hawkins story is fascinating because that connection only came about because I was just coming to the end of my interview with Pete Brown, and we were winding down. We'd pretty much finished the formal interview, and I was saying, I said the only other person we were talking about Elysian and the way Syd kind of Elysian and eliding of certain cutting out of bits. And I said the only other person who reminds me of that is Spike Hawkins' poetry, knowing that Pete knew Spike really well, at which Pete delivers the bombshell. I can see it now, sitting at his nice pine table in his kitchen, he went, I think Syd knew Spike. Wow, we're off, Next minute, I have a phone number. I have Spike on the other end of the phone. Yeah, come on around some whatever day, Went round to his flat. And, of course, he told me all this fascinating stuff about them doing the poetry broth together, yeah. And, of course, that's where it all begins. That's it. I imagine Syd was doing cut-up sort of stuff anyway. But, yeah, the Spike Hawkins connection. And to this day, that's one of the bits. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, God forbid. What? But that's one of the bits I'm proudest of in that book, that I actually found the Spike Hawkins connection. Because that never...
Once you know that, once you know that connection, it makes much more sense of everything else.
And I'm a big fan of Spike. I'm a big fan of Spike Hawkins' poetry. I've got all his stuff. They always used to remind me of Syd. I used to think the only other person I know writes like this is Syd. And of course, there they are working together in 1968, I think, originally, just after Syd's left the Floyd, when he's not doing much.
Am I right in thinking that you could write off and ask for a set of slips of paper and get them in the post or something like that at the time?
I've got poetry broth. I've got the. Oh yeah.
You have, but in the 60s, could you order it through the post? I think like that if you wanted.
Yeah, I think there's only one colour generic version now, but I think there were various versions of it. Yeah, and they're fascinating. Yeah, but so there was that connection, but where were we going? Because we were going back to like the word thing. Oh yeah, with the words. Yeah, the fact that Syd would change the words all the time as well. Of course, that's why there's still a couple of footnotes in the book where we genuinely don't know what it is, what he's singing. There are about 2 or 3 versions. It could be this. It could be this. Even when you've isolated the vocal, because of course there's the Mandrax slur here and there as well. Taking Mandrax is not necessarily conducive to cohesive, articulate lyrics, because there'll be a bit of a slur. you hear it. I think you hear the kind of when he's on downers. I think you hear it on the full start of It's in You. You hear it in, yes, I'm thinking. And I think I can hear Mandrax in that. I can hear somebody, he's on downers when he's recording that, you know. You can just hear it. The dry mouthness of it as well, you know.
Thinking of him in the studio, did you have an opportunity to meet Malcolm Jones?
Never. I saw that in your guide questions to me. No, never came across the man at all, but I did send off for his nice little book that he wrote in the early 80s. And I got a copy of that. I've got that with all my other Syd memorabilia. Again, when there were just a few hundred, there was maybe a few thousand by the early 80s, you'd have thought, wouldn't you? Well, there would have been, because there were the guys petitioning to get Opal released, weren't there? I mean, let's give credit here where credit's due, you know. That would not have seen the light of day if it hadn't have been for the Syd fanatics going and saying, we know there's more stuff in the archive, you know. Yeah, we've heard it. Because I've got a very early bootleg from CP Lee did it for me, Chris Lee, who was in Alberto's Los Trios Paranoias, and he was recording at EMI at the same time as Pete Jenner was next door putting those comp tapes together. And so he ran Chris a copy off, and several years later I ended up working with Chris, in fact, at Salford University, and Chris gave me a tape where there is the double track, the wonderful double track version of You Fill Me Away Far Too Empty, Oh So Alone, and it's a beautiful double track version. And I think the only reason they didn't put it out was it goes out of sync after a while. Syd is a bit out of sync with his own double tracking, and it does get a bit messy. But I would have even put up with that on a record. I still to this day don't know why that hasn't come out, because it's a bit, given that there are other versions of that song out, numerous other takes, but no one's ever put out that double track one that I see him Jenner put together himself, you know. And it's
Is it because it's lost? Is it possibly lost?
Well, lost like all these other things are supposedly lost.
As in, well, the Peter Jenner reel from '74 was lost, wasn't it?
I mean, I've got everything off that.
Well, you've got a tape copy of it, as does other people, but I think that the master reel is lost. It left. I'm sorry, this is a bit nerdy.
Be nerdy.
I think it left Manchester Square, never to be seen again.
Like Living Alone, Stoned Alone, and that's out there somewhere. Which I've always been told that was a really good song, you know. Or of course, the ultimate, and of course I do play with this in Unsung, Unsaid. Of course, is Joe Boyd's lost tape. You know, is all the stuff that Syd did for him on what would have been a solo album. You know, so obviously, let's not plot spoil here at all. But I do play with that in Unsung, Unsaid, because that's too good a thing not to use. You know, there's so many what ifs around Syd and Nick. That's what I meant when I said earlier. There were always other avenues to go down. I could always pursue, what might have happened here or what could have happened there.
There's an interesting structural thing in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, two things are true. One is that the words Pink Floyd never actually appear in the book. I don't remember seeing them.
They don't.
And each of his bandmates appears or is referenced once each. I think there's one reference to Nick Mason, one to Richard Wright, and then a longer one involving Roger Waters. Am I correct about that?
Yes, the words Pink Floyd do not appear once in the book. They are just generically referred to as the band or my band occasionally.
The group, yeah.
Nick only appears once. Rick only appears once. David appears only as Fred, his nickname. And there's no mention of Dave in that book at all. There's just Fred.
Fred,
yeah.
Okay.
And I think I call him Fred the van driver, because he was driving a van for the boutique he was working for at one point, wasn't he? And of course, Waters appears in the school scenes early on, where he is, where he is the other Rog, But that's right. That was. I think that came about partly because I wanted to avoid any copyright issues, and it became a device in itself after a while. I thought, that's a bit, have you got it yet, isn't it? Let's do the ultimate thing here. Let's have this all about that band, but never mention that band by name. I really got into that after a while. After a while I thought, right, this is a policy now. By about chapter 6, I thought they are not going to be mentioned. And yeah, no, that was it. I was pleased, and I'm glad you picked up on that. But yeah, that's quite deliberate, because also, you see, I mean, I did have an idea at one point about doing a screenplay based on a young Syd and an old Syd, and I even put together. I put together a storyboard of it. I didn't write any scripts or anything, but I storyboarded the whole thing out. This is what we could do. We could do flashbacks to old reclusive Syd, and then flashbacks to young Syd juxtaposed. It never got any further than me storyboarding it. In fact, I did send it to David Gilmour, and with usual Pink Floyd remoteness, I never heard a thing back. And I suppose a seed was sown then, actually. I mean, I said earlier that this all started life as a tweet. I think maybe I did have an inkling of, I've got to do something with this, I've got to do something. It would lend itself to a screenplay, although, like a lot of people, I'm very wary of there being a really bad biopic about Syd.
I was going to ask you about a biopic.
And indeed, Nick. I mean, I think it's fair to say I don't exactly see eye to eye with Richard Morton Jack, who wrote the Nick biography. He called my Psychedelia book one of the worst books ever written. But let's not hold that against him, because one of the things that I do admire him for was, I think he's got it stipulated into his contract that nobody can make a screenplay, based on the work he did for his biography. And I fully applaud that, actually. The world doesn't need a really bad Nick Drake biopic. It really doesn't. And it doesn't need a bad Syd one either. I've seen a few treatments of Syd ones. I mean, Pink Floyd management have said to me, we get sent them all the time. They're all, without exception, awful. And I know that because I've been sent one or two as well, and they are beyond awful. And of course, they're always really literal. I didn't want to go the literal route with any of this. There was I always parody it as, there was never going to be any scene where when someone goes, "Hey Syd, look, a scarecrow." Do you know what I mean? There was never going to be any of that in the book, any of it at all. The only biopic I really like in recent years is the wonderful Brian Wilson one. And I thought that was beautiful, again, because they used two Brians, and there is only one moment in the entire film where you think, oh God, here we go, where I think Brian is sitting by the piano with Mike Love, and Mike Love goes, "Hey Brian, do you remember," or was it Brian says to Mike, I don't remember, I think Brian says it to Mike, he says, "Do you remember when Mum says that dogs could pick up vibrations?" And you think, oh God, here we go. But they don't. They sidestep it. They just move on to something else. And I thought, wonderful. Just leave it there as a tantalizing little hint, but then move on. So if I ever do that in the book, even vaguely, I think there is only one vague, oblique reference to diamonds and shining on like diamonds. But I'm not going to say what it is. I mean, the reader will find it. Do your detective work. No. There is one very oblique mention, but it'll take the spotters to go, again, it's another one of my little see what you did there, because I hate those biopics that just go the literal route all the time. And that's all they ever do. It brings out the worst kind of writing in people. And of course, they're driven by the discographies all the time. I mean, that awful Queen one, Bohemian Rhapsody, where they just, I know we're going a bit off topic here, but and I'm ranting, but it is, it's just discography driven, It's like, oh, right, hey, now we're going to do, "We Will Rock You." I've got an idea, guys, stamps his foot, yeah. And you just think it insults the audience. It really does. At no point in my book did I want to ever be insulting the audience. Actually, the opposite. Make them do some work occasionally. Do some work. Do a little bit of you put the clues together, Here's the clues, or here's the jigsaw pieces. You put it together.
So, Rob, you've obviously had a very productive last few years with the lyrics book, with Unsung, Unsaid. And I guess the last question I was thinking of asking was, where next? Is there an area of research in respect of Pink Floyd or Nick Drake that particularly interests you? Is there anything on the horizon in that regard, or are you going to be doing something completely different?
I've done some other stuff. I've been writing like a maniac for years now. I've written a book a year since about 2015. The fact that nobody wants to publish them anymore, I just think I'll do it myself then. No, I've got a couple of novels lined up. The next one's completely different. The next one is about an alternative comedian. It's set in the 1980s, and it's about an alternative comedian, a very damaged alternative comedian. I seem to be drawn to damaged people, and I've got a novel ready after that as well, which I won't go into at the moment. I've possibly got one other music book I want to do, But that's come about through my complete disenchantment with most music writing at the moment. Where to begin with this? I read a couple of biographies in recent years about bands I like, and both of them by writers I admire. But I was bored stiff halfway through both of them because I thought, this is just, then they did this album, then they did that album, then they split up, then they reformed, and I'm done with all that. I'll say I'm nearly 70. If I've got anything left to say about music, I want to find new ways of writing about music. And I've got ideas for a music book based on there's still whole areas of the past we can find new ways to talk about. I don't like most of the biopics. I don't like most nostalgia programs because they always go the same routes. Always. They tell the same story over and over and over again. And it's so boring. It really is. I've heard it so many times. So I started formulating ideas for a book. The kind of working title is Way In, Way Out. And it's the subtitle is New Cartography for Old Maps, or New Cartography for Tired Old Maps. And it's new ways of writing about the past. I won't, tell you what they're about at the moment. But if I do another music book, it won't be about anything to do with all the established things. And I've got to say, actually, publishers rejecting me, because you've got to remember, I'm not going to get bitter about this in the slightest, because it's given me a whole new lease of life. But to a man and a woman, well, actually, no, I think they're all men, every one of them. Every publisher I approached with Unsung, Unsaid, nobody wanted to know, nobody was interested. I thought this would get picked up in weeks. I thought this would I thought someone would, bite this out of my hand, because this is such a good idea. I was so pleased with it. Nothing, tumbleweed. And so I thought, right, sod it, I'll do it myself. Truth is, at the moment of talking, I've sold 330 copies in just over 2 months with nothing other than social media and, the loyalty of my nice loyal band of readers who know they'll get a good product out of me, and they'll know I'll treat them with respect and the subject with respect, And I have to say, I've been bowled over by the response I've been getting, because I've had all these lovely reviews, and they're not gushing reviews. They're really thoughtful, insightful reviews. And I haven't had a bad review yet. And I thought, this is justified doing it as a self-publishing thing. I was uneasy originally about going down that route, but I thought, no, this is too good to sit on. This is too good not to put out, And I knew there was an audience out there for it. I knew Syd Barrett and Nick Drake fans in themselves is a formidable constituency. That is a lot of people. There are thousands of people on those Facebook pages and on the websites, and a lot of them are articulate, learned, and they know their topic inside out. And if I do this topic justice and with respect and love for the subject, I know that they will come to it, they will like it. And that's proven to be true. I think momentum's only just getting started. I can see this having another 1,000 by the end of the year, and I know plenty of music books that don't even sell 300. So, it's justified doing it. And that has pleased me so much, because it can be a lonely thing writing as just you and your keyboard and your thoughts and going out in the garden and musing on where shall I go next. And so to be getting all these lovely Amazon reviews I've been getting and Goodreads reviews, it's wonderful, because I thought, this is why you do it. This is, and I'm bowled over by it. I treat the reader with respect. I wasn't going to give them a shoddy product, even to the extent of having a really good cover. I went to the Mick Rock estate. I went to the Keith Morris estate to say, can I use these pictures on my cover? And they were both, again, they saw that I was coming from a good place, and they said, yes, you can. And neither of them charged me either, because it was a self-published thing, And I'm so pleased with that. I'm so pleased that they allowed me to do that.
I don't know if you want a review from a very, very young demographic, but one thing I can tell you is I have a daughter who's just about to turn 2, and of all the books I've brought into my house, she was absolutely drawn to it. She pointed to it and seemed completely galvanized by it. So there you go.
She'll be 15 in the blink of an eye, and she'll go, hey, you knew this guy?
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed. I think we've covered just about everything, Rob, that was on my list. How about you, Phil?
Mine as well.
Rob, thank you. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion.
Sorry about all the technical issues at the beginning. But
it's no problem at all. Our listeners will probably not hear any of them if we do our job properly.
Well, let me know when this is going to go out then, won't you? Let me know, and I'll big it up on my 5,000 followers on Twitter. Yeah. formerly X.
We will indeed. We look forward to perhaps speaking to you again at a later date. I feel like in some respects we've only barely touched the surface. I would certainly, if we'd have had more time, asked you more about stars. I would have asked you about Hyde Park 1970, and Phil and I are somewhat obsessed with Pink Floyd at the BBC, so the news at the beginning of the conversation that you were there in 1971 was grabbed me as well. And then I would also have asked you about 1967 and Moni Aldous, but those are all things probably for another day. It's been all good.
Well, we can always do a part 2 another time, you know. The outtakes.
That would be nice.
I think we'd quite love
the babbling
yes.
outtakes, yeah. Opal spelt with an E or an A, it's up to you. Yeah.